Hi, everyone, and welcome to Education 438, Teaching Reading and Writing in the Content Area, Week 10 Overview. I hope you have some caffeine. I have some with me, and I hope you are having a great week. So I'm going to jump right into talking about Week 10. Week 10, in a lot of ways, is a continuation of Week 9 and the focus that Week 9 placed on close reading. So, as per usual, I'm going to start with a recap of Week 9, move into our Week 10 topics, our Week 10 learning objectives, our essential questions for the week, our reading and assignments for the week, and then any reminders that I have, I will save for the end. So, jumping back into Week 9, even though a lot of what we are doing this semester feeds into one another, I tried to break it up so that we started with academic language and academic skills, moved into vocabulary. Now we're moving and we're in the midst of reading, and then we'll end with writing. So, week 9 really focused on close reading as an instructional strategy. We thought a lot about the CCSS reading standards, evaluating and understanding text complexity. What does the teacher do in the close reading process? What does the reader or the student do? Sample lesson plans that aligned with Common Core reading standards. And then I also included a really brief AVID strategy on marking the text for you all to be able to explore what a very basic close reading technique in the classroom would look like. So I think those of you who watched my video from last week, as I said then, I have a lot of thoughts on close reading. Coffee break. But what I did appreciate about last week's reading was that the authors of A Close Look at Close Reading really emphasize that text complexity goes beyond just a text quantitative features. And I think this is so important because Lexile levels don't always necessarily consider content or the mature themes of a text. And then fundamentally, I feel like we have to consider our students, right? We know best where our students are in terms of what they can grapple with, what's going to challenge them, and what they're going to be engaged by. So I think text complexity is a complex topic. And I think that if you end up at a school that really, really, really emphasizes quantitative features of a text, there's always some room to push back with the Common Core kind of standing you up, right? Having your back. Because once again, text complexity goes beyond just those quantitative features to look at content, to look at reader task and who the reader is, etc. So that was a huge takeaway for me. Um, Here's another one. Close reading as an instructional strategy can be hard to adjust to for both teachers and students. And this is in part because I think teachers have a tendency, and generally it's because of wanting to help our students. We have a tendency to front load information, to give our students as much pre-reading and background information as we can before they wrestle with the hard text. Whereas close reading really emphasizes giving the text to the student and letting the student grapple with that text, with, of course, some supports that are in place. But I think that this can be hard, right? When students are really used to their teachers front-loading information for them, or when we as teachers are really used to doing that, close reading can feel a little bit scary because we're giving students really complex text to grapple with. But at least in my experience, I've found that they really do rise to the occasion. All right, reading is transactional. So in this week's reading too, there's so much emphasis on text dependency, right, in close reading. So what's contained within the four corners of the text. And don't get me wrong, like I said last week, I do think that this is very important, but I don't know. I'm a Rosenblatt theorist, so I am heavy into reader response, and I do feel like reading is always a transactional experience between a reader and a text, right? And we always bring some level of ourselves to that text, even when we're trying to be as objective as possible. So it involves a relationship between a reader and a text, and it does involve a deep understanding of what is confined in the text. But for me, I don't think we can fully divorce what we bring to a text from our interaction with it, at least not completely. But you could absolutely disagree with me, right? Like I said, I'm heavy on the Rosenblatt theory that reader response is always kind of a transactional interaction between a reader and a text. But I kind of feel like why not both, right? Close reading is important. We want our students to be able to fully comprehend what is in a text and to take ownership of that. But we also want our students to see reading as an experience between themselves and the text in which they do bring part of themselves to the table. So why not both, right? All right, this week we're going to keep going. So, we're going to keep talking about practical approaches to planning and implementing close reading. We're going to think about selecting texts for close reading. What does that look like? Creating text-dependent questions that sort of advance in the complex thinking they ask students to do. Understanding text annotation and as an essential literacy skill. I am a big advocate for text annotation, but also a big advocate for letting students figure out what kind of text annotation best services their understanding. Common Core text exemplars, there is a whole appendix, Appendix B, of the ELA literacy standards that list text after text after text that could be a complex text you could use for close reading. Oral strategies to communicate effectively about close reading. So, close reading is not just about asking the students to read a text and grapple with it and understand it and be able to answer questions surrounding it. It's also about students being able to talk about what they've close read with other students and with you as the teacher. So, here are our learning objectives. Students will continue to familiarize themselves with close reading as a literacy building activity through considering how to select texts and how to build and use text-dependent questions so that students can have better reading comprehension. Students will understand the importance of explicit instruction and modeling regarding text annotation and close reading. I can't speak enough to this, everyone. If we want our students to be able to annotate well and be able to read well, we have to model how we do those things too. Students will browse through the CCSS ELA Literacy Appendix B to find potential text exemplars to teach close reading in their intended grade level and content area. Students will examine oral strategies and activities for engaging students in conversations about close reading assignments. And finally, it is our final pod post of the semester, and we're going to go back to our original pod post format by doing a Notice Wander connection quote activity, and then a secondary activity that asks you to practice creating text-dependent questions that increase in complexity. And I'll review that at the end of this video. So, as always, I like to give you essential questions to think about as you are reading this week. And you do have a lot of reading. After this week, the reading does die down a little bit for a couple of weeks, but this week is very reading heavy. The irony, of course, is that I'm going to ask you to close read what you were reading about close reading. And these essential questions will hopefully help you do that. What does preparation work for close reading instruction look like? So, what do we have to do as teachers to prepare to engage in this kind of work with our students? What questions should we ask ourselves when selecting a text to use for close reading activities? And this is a continuation in part of the conversations on text complexity that our authors provided with us last week. What are text-dependent questions? How might the questions we ask students to engage with during close reading differ from questions we might use to get them to personally connect to a text? So I was an English teacher. I am an English teacher. And a lot of times the questions that I ask my students ask them to focus on what's in the text, but then ask them to go beyond. So I want you to think about how text-dependent questions might differ from questions that we ask sometimes that are a little bit more personal in nature. Why is it important to provide direct instruction and modeling for text annotation and close reading? What arguments support close reading as an essential component in all disciplinary learning and instruction? We know that the Common Core state standards really emphasize reading and writing across all the content areas and not just within English language arts. So we're going to read about some arguments that support disciplinary learning and instruction through close reading in every single content. What strategies support students in talking about what they close read? What particular tools support struggling readers in engaging with close reading? So kind of like I mentioned earlier, close reading does involve a certain level of students wrestling with the text on their own. But I do think that there's a lot of supports that we can put in place to help students do that. Modeling annotation is one of those. You're going to read about this in this week's reading, but sentence starters are a great way to scaffold close reading, especially for English language learners. All right, real quick before I go over readings and assignments for this week. We do have a required Zoom meeting this Wednesday. This is an important one because I am going to talk through, in large part, the next stage of our unit plan and sort of what we need to know to be able to do that stage well. We're also going to talk about close reading too. And then reminders, like I said, we can all celebrate because your final pod post is happening this week and is due, of course, Sunday the 26th by 11:59 p.m. So real quick, let me pull up our week 10 overview. You'll see our topics and our objectives there. My video, the one I'm filming now, will pop up. So lots of reading this week, okay? I would pace it out over the week so that you're not doing tons and tons of reading in one day. We're all reading pages 60 to 77, chapter 3 together. But then I'm going to ask you to choose the grade level of the close reading example that most closely aligns with the grade level you'll be teaching. For example, I did a look at close reading in grade 9 because I do high school and higher education. So from there, you'll read chapter 4, pages 100 through 124, and then you'll choose the pages that most closely relate to the discipline that you want to teach. For my art ed people, I would maybe go English humanities or social sciences, but that's totally up to you. And then just a few pages in chapter 5 that look at those oral strategies for getting students talking about their close reading. Here's our required Zoom meeting. And then our week 10 assignments. You'll be very excited to see that you have little to no reading next week because you'll be working on stage 2 of your unit plan. So the other things I've included in this week's module, just pop back to that, is a very, very quick summation of close reading and some extension videos if you're interested. The Common Core Appendix B, which includes text exemplars, because you might be wanting to use this for this week's pod post. Then here's your pod post. And I apologize last week. For some reason, your pod post did not actually post to your pod itself, but to the class. So I appreciate you all being willing to comment on new people's posts that went outside of your groups. But I made sure this week that we are within that pod post that you've been working with all semester for this final pod post. So part 1, like I said, is a Notice, Wonder, Connect quote activity. I wanted to take it back to the first pod post that we did this semester, which asked you to do this. Please, please, please be as specific as possible in this part 1 so I know that you did the reading. So for example, don't focus all of your answers only on chapter 3 or only on chapter 5. Spread it out. Show me that you have engaged in close reading of all weekly content about close reading. So have some fun here. Be specific. Part 2, I'm excited about, but that's because I'm a nerd and I love text annotation and creating questions. So I want you to select a very short, complex, so challenging text that you might assign your students to close read in the grade level and content area in which you plan to teach. This could be related to your unit plan, so it could be one of the texts that you're using for that, but it doesn't have to be. This could just be an activity in and of itself in which you are practicing close reading and creating text-dependent questions. So if you're struggling, you can use the link to the CCSS text exemplars included under this week's module if you're having a hard time finding one. And it can be short, right? It can be a paragraph. So don't get crazy here. Close read the text yourself, annotate it, whatever you need to do. And please include a link or an image to that text within this pod post so I can read it as well. And so can your pod members. Then address the following. Just tell me the title of the text, the author, and then the page numbers or the chunk of the text that you would have students focus on. And then I want you to create 6 text-dependent questions you might ask students after or during a close read of the text. So you can use the Fisher and Frey model on page 66 to 67 of a close look at close reading to create these questions that progress through a hierarchy of complexity. So return to this because I think this is a great model for understanding how to move students to deeper and more complex levels of understanding a text through the questions that you ask them, okay? Starting with the kind of smaller parts of the text and moving to the text as a whole. Remember that these questions should be rooted in the text and should prompt students to use textual evidence, right? Close reading is all about students having to read and understand the text carefully in order to answer questions, in order to talk about the text, in order to own the text. So, yeah, have fun with this final pod post this week, you all. I can't believe it's our last one, but yeah, I mean, the semester is starting to slowly kind of dwindle down. So keep that in mind. All right, everyone. I think that's it. I look forward to seeing everyone on Wednesday's Zoom. And if you have any questions, as always, please reach out and have a great day.